to continue.
Absolutely.
So as you recall, now it's been 2 weeks, so let's go back to that session 2 weeks back, where we had started discussing impact evaluation. And as you know, this is where now a lot of people are paying attention when they talk evaluation. A lot of this data gathering, everything is for trying to understand outcome or impact, right? So what we'll do is let's revisit a little bit, what we had discussed. And if you recall, there was that example, right, of the compensatory maths program for class 5 that we had taken. So let me start by going back to that and kind of reminding ourselves what we had discussed, and then taking it forward to build up, a deeper understanding of impact. Yeah, so that's the plan for today. So let me just, I need to share my screen. Yeah. So yeah, since we are a small enough group, please do kind of interrupt, stop me where needed. We can do a little more of a discussion style. And so this was the slide that I presented last time, and on which we had done the small group discussion, right? So just to remind ourselves, my program is just frozen. Let's just hope that it. Let's try it. Okay. So we had discussed this case. Let's get back to those details, because that will help us as we build further on this. So large school, 25 students get less than 50% marks in class 5. And on average, they're getting 30%. So school thinks this is a bit of a problem. And so it promotes them to class 6, but it enrolls them simultaneously in an after-school remedial maths program. And it's a well-done program, pedagogically speaking. And we find a year later in the class 6 maths exam, this group of 25 students scores 70% on average, while in class 5 the final exam, they were scoring 30% on average. And therefore, the question was, can we conclude that the impact was this difference? If you think that the maths exam, after all, picks up math skills, maths performance, whatever outcome that we are interested in, then it's going from 30 to 70. So that difference of 40, can we say it is because of the program, right? And we saw many reasons why this may not be a good claim. So that's where we had left it last time. So I just want to remind us that really outcome or impact evaluation is about this kind of claim, that my program made such and such difference to some outcome, right? To kids staying on in school, not dropping out, or their learning levels improving, or more girls participating, whatever it is that we ultimately care about, for which we had done a needs assessment, for which we had created this program in the first place. Impact evaluation is basically saying that my program did change matters, and it's because, right? That's the causal language, as I said last time, is built into impact evaluation. It's because of my program, right? In other words, if my program had not happened, then they would not have had that kind of improvement, right? So impact evaluation is all about good ways of attributing things to the program, that my program made so much difference. So based on the discussion that we had 2 weeks back, last time we met, I've just prepared this slide, which is all the different reasons that the 3 groups had discussed as to why this would be a misattribution to say that 30 to 70 increase is because of my program, right? One set of reasons is coaching centers, assistance at home, other things which make these kids do better, which we are misattributing to our remedial maths program. Or it could be that class 6 regular teaching is better because of the drill that they follow, the materials, and so on. It could be that other competencies are being gained by these kids. After all, they're in the 10, 11 age group, so they're learning language skills and so on. Other things is competencies which might actually cause them to do better at maths, right? So again, many other causal factors, right, is what we pointed out the last session. Also, maybe grading pattern, you can't really compare class 5 and class 6 final exams. Maybe it's different and so on. And also it could be that class 6, they're doing better because they're getting used to taking exams. And so that reduces exam anxiety, right? This is the set of things that we had discussed last time. Okay. So, well, let me just pause in case anybody has any kind of follow-up questions. But this is from my notes. This is sort of the set of things that we had thought. And all of these will interfere with our attribution of impact to the program, correct? Many of them will end up overestimating the program impact because actually it's the coaching center. It's actually the parents at home. Actually, it is the other competency. Actually, it's these other things which are being wrongfully picked up by the program effect, right? So a lot of those could lead to overestimation of the program effect. And of course, these things matter because the school might decide we are going to run this on a regular basis because this program is causing so much impact, right? So even from a practical perspective, it is useful to get it right. So yeah, any quick thoughts on this? I'm going to continue with this example, but before I proceed, just checking in with you. Everybody okay with this, right? With this recap of what we did last time. Okay. There were a few other things which had come up, which I put in the slide, but I'm not going to, some of you had talked about, the design of this remedial maths program could lead to stigma, other things. How exactly was it implemented? Was it the regular class 6 teacher? Could it be that some kids are benefiting, but not all? So the average business is not enough, right? We want to care particularly of the kids who are lagging behind. Can we compare it with other peers who are not in the program? I mean, there were many other interesting things which were mentioned, though these are not really about attributing or misattributing to the program, right? So this is also something we have discussed. So now I'm going to sort of move to a little more material from our last meeting. This slide lists 5 terms which may not be familiar to you. These are slightly strange terms. I'll explain. But these are terms which are usually used to show potential problems with attributing cause or impact in any social program. Okay. I'm going to just go through these 5, and you will see that we actually discussed many of them. We didn't just use these kinds of terms. That's all, right? So it's useful to now put some terms. These terms are a little awkward, but let me explain. So, and sometimes in the literature, the general phrase is threats to internal validity. Internal validity is just a fancy term in research to talk about causal attribution. Okay, can you make causal claims, and what are the threats to such claims, right? So there are these 5. The first is what is called the history threat, and it simply means what I've put here, which is some other event which affected the outcome, which happened to coincide with our program, right? Coincidence, the word literally means happening at the same time, right? Coincide. So in fact, many of you mentioned that maybe coaching centers the kids are going to, which happens to coincide with the remedial maths program, correct? or the parents are helping these kids at home, that's coinciding with the remedial maths program. So this is a class of threats, so to speak. That is to say, a set of things which can happen, which is actually causing impact, and we are wrongfully crediting our program. Correct. So that's the history threat, which is some other thing which is happening, which coincides, right, with our program. The second is what is called a maturation threat, which is that in this case, our kids, right, they're growing. They're picking up language skills. They're wandering around outside home more often, right? They're going to the shops, as I said last time. And so there are other things in their general maturation which might explain why they're doing better in maths, right? In the exam. And so maturation is just some kind of natural, so to speak, process that is happening, among the people that our program is involved with, and those natural processes are actually creating some impact. And this is particularly true when you talk about kids, right? It also might be true for adults or villages or other bigger units, but certainly with kids, maturation could be the actual kind of cause. So that's the second one, which we also discussed in last session for that example.
Also,
So,
like not
yeah.
just a biological maturation, but also social, right?
Yes, maturation. Yeah. So natural so what is natural is the question. By natural, I didn't mean only biological, absolutely. Just what is normally likely to happen with those, with the folks, right, without our program. So normally these kids will start playing, and they'll form groups, they'll do this, that, and the other. So the social maturation, biological maturation, maybe cognitive, many things, absolutely. So what is normally likely to happen to them, right, is what we mean here. Then the third, this is something which we did not discuss actually in the last class, which is called the mortality threat. The term mortality, as you know, means kind of death, right? Mortality. Here it simply means dropping out. Okay. So oftentimes, some kids might drop out of our program, or they might drop out of the test, correct? It could be that all 25 actually stayed in the remedial maths program, but all 25 did not show up for the final exam, right? That's some are sick or whatever. Or it could be that not all 25 stayed in our program. So suppose 10 of them dropped out, but they still took your final exam, right? So it could complicate things. So because we are talking about measurement across time, correct? It's not easy to make sure that it's the same group that we are able to follow. And this is often true in the kinds of end lines and baselines you do, right? You may not get the exact same people, but you hope that you get approximately similar sort, and you hope that the average will be okay, right? But sometimes it may not be. So we'll come back to this. So that's the dropouts, right? Dropouts from our program or dropouts from our measurement, right? The test here is measuring the outcome, right? And then the fourth is what is called instrumentation threat, which is simply this is something that one of the groups had mentioned in our last session, which is you can't compare your pre-test with your post-test. Here, the pre-test was the class 5 final exam, and the post-test was the class 6 final exam. Pre and post in terms of our program, correct? Our program ran in class 6. So we measured their maths levels before our program, the pre-test, with their class 5 final exam. And the post-test is we measuring their math skills after our program, which is the final exam of class 6. It could be that these tests are not comparable. This is very tricky because you might say that ideally we want to administer the same test, right? To know what's the difference. But but class 5 final exam and class 6 final exam can't be similar, correct? Because the exams will be looking at whatever portions were covered, And so you could argue that this is an apple to orange comparison. You can't really. So when we say that the average for class 5 final exam was 30% and the average for class 6 final exam was 70%, you could say these are not the same thing and you cannot do 70 minus 30. Right? And so that would lead to what is called this instrumentation threat, right? So for example, it could be that the class 6 final exam is much harder. Okay. Even if you factor in the fact that they've learned a little more in class 6, but it's just much harder. In which case the 70 minus 30 may be underestimating the true program impact, right? Because you just gave them a very hard final post-test. On the other hand, suppose you gave a very easy post-test. Suppose class 6 final exam was really easy for some reason, right? So that might explain why all the kids did so well, 70%. In which case you're overestimating the program, right? So this is a very tricky thing. How do you keep your measure constant to measure over time?
Yeah.
Right? See, it's different for example, health indicators, right? Such as, like the TINP example we did, for little kids and so on, weight, height, things like that. You have a measure, the measure itself, you can say, yeah, so many inches, 1 year back, now the kid has grown so many inches now, it means something. But here, it's tricky, right? So I'm just pointing that out. Now, how do we solve this? We have to think of different ways, but clearly final exam may not be a good, because final exam has other reasons for preparing it, correct? So we might want to have a specially designed test, and we might want that test to be the same in pre-test and post-test, exactly the same.
Something like ASAR?
It could be ASAR, but ASAR also varies their, the exact numbers, right? Subtract 2 3-digit numbers and so on. But there could be an argument for giving the exact same test, just literal copy.
Right.
Because how do you know that even if you change the numbers, right, you might, right? So there's a lot of now effort that has to go into seeing whether 2 separate 3-digit subtraction sums are actually similar, correct? And in fact, math educators do these kinds of things. You have to go through that process, right? It might depend upon where the 0 is placed, and you might trip up, kids in terms of place values. So there might be an argument for giving the exact same, so that so that you have no doubt that there's some that the difficulty level was different. Yes, Rakesh, I think you have your hand raised.
Yeah, actually, what you were explaining about the pre-test and post-test, how it how both are it's very critical to design the both the tests. Actually, during our program, sometimes we also feel this difficulty, and it is actually very difficult to design both pre-test and post-test in a manner that it should not get influenced by any other factor. So do you have anything like any explanation what kind of criterias or indicators we should have while designing the question, so both the test parameters should match to each other?
Yeah. So luckily this is so short answer is these are available. I'm not right now, equipped to go into it well, but I'm going to note this down, Rakesh. Let's come back to this. Yeah. But there's a whole kind of sub group of people who work on this, how to make kind of comparable, even like, unseen passage, right? Comprehension passage in a language test, right? How do you assess similarity of levels? And there are criteria which have been developed for language, for maths, for different, it's kind of subject specific and age specific, level specific as well, right? So short answer is there are people who do this, who kind of have developed expertise for this. That's not my expertise, and anyway, I'm not sort of prepared, but I'm going to make a note of this and we'll come back to it, because I can see why this very specific matter will be of interest.
Yeah, thank you.
But good news is, educationists have kind of worked on this. Yeah, Seema, please go ahead.
Yeah, usually I guess it's all aligned to learning outcomes, right? Or
Yeah, but the thing is, mapping from learning outcome to the specifics, right? You can
yeah,
get tripped up.
because like a typical in case of a math, this thing is able to do two-digit subtraction with borrowing, without borrowing.
Yeah, right. So now you have to make all those. Yeah.
Yeah.
But think of unseen passage, right? It's hard, really hard to know, right?
Yeah.
So
But
how do you
still
actually
there
break
are
it down?
from language perspective also, there are those learning outcomes in terms of use of adjectives or adverbs or
Exactly.
prepositions or multiple phrases, etc. There are
Exactly. Yeah,
specific
yeah.
outcomes on which
Right.
tests are designed.
Exactly. And I think that's what Rakesh was asking. So yeah, people have come up with these kinds of criteria, or at least indicative criteria, which are subject specific. So I'm making a note of this. We can come back to this. And I think there's a lot of kind of documentation of this as well. So, and this is something that Rahul and Dvitya will know more about. So we'll come back to this for sure. Yeah. But the general point right now, we are still sort of sticking with the conceptual point that how do you make sure that your measures are comparable? Otherwise, if your measures themselves are changing, then that the difference may not pick up the program effect. And finally, number 5 is the testing threat, also called the priming test, which threat, which is to say, having taken a test once or being measured once, that act itself affects how a person might do the next time around, right? Which is why people say take a lot of tests, right? When you prepare for some board exam or some other, competitive exam, right? Just that discipline of taking lots of them makes you a better test taker, right? And so if so, then you're actually overestimating the program impact, right? Because in fact, some of the change between the pre and the post test is because they're getting better at taking tests. You will notice that there is a little bit of potential kind of conflict, small conflict between number 4 and 5. That is to say, suppose you decide that you'll give the identical pre-test as the post-test, right? So that you don't get into all this criteria and all these things that Rakesh and Seema were mentioning, right? You just give the same one. So you can be sure that there's no change. But if you give the same one, the problem is students might remember a little bit, right? And so if you give the exact same one, then you are in slightly greater chance of the priming. So you might want to change it a little bit. But the moment you change it a little bit, you might run into instrumentation problem, right? How do you know that then they're completely comparable? So you can see that these two can create a little bit of conflict, right? So yeah, but in general, priming can be an issue, especially with education programs. Maybe less true for other kinds of programs. Yeah. Or we have to find other more innovative ways of gauging impact rather than getting students to take tests, right? So there could be other ways to do it as well. But with testing or with interviews, right? These kinds of things, the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so you might be picking up that effect rather than the program effect. The big ones in this, right? I would say, well, they're all important, but often number 1 is the biggest. Something else is happening, right? Which coincides with your program. And that could in a major way affect, but all the others also have a role depending on the specifics of one's program. Okay. Now, so as I said, even though we didn't use all this kind of specific terminology or language in our discussion last session, we kind of covered all of these except maybe number 3, because you all thought of real world situations, right? Where this kind of 70 minus 30 will not do, right? Will not pick up the true program effect, right? So yeah, but it's useful to think of these 5 because this is the set of what they call threats to validity, threats to causal attribution from a program, right? So we'll come back to these. So now let me mention something that we all know, that the way in which mainstream impact evaluation addresses all these problems, right? is by creating a comparison group or a control group, right? So you run the program with some people, and then you see what's happening with them um, uh, before the program, after the program, but you also study or track another bunch of people who are somewhat comparable, but who are not getting your program. Hence, they are called the control or comparison group. And so by looking at the difference between the two groups, you might be able to pick up the program effect, right? So this is an intuition that you will be familiar with, but we're going to discuss this in some detail, right?
What is CT?
C is control and T is treatment, right?
Achha.
So two groups basically, right?
Not very good with the abbreviation, sorry.
No, yeah. So C is sometimes called comparison. T, usually in this impact evaluation literature, whoever gets your program, they are called the treatment group. Of course, it's a slightly awkward term. This term comes, as you can guess, from kind of medical, pharmacological, medical literature, because that's where this kind of thing has happened for a long, long time. Right, so you're treating somebody with a drug, right, to see whether that drug has some effect on them. So hence this term treatment. And control, again, these are very harsh terms, control, right, or comparison. So yeah, terms may not be the most elegant, but these are the standard terms used. Yeah. Yeah. So notice that earlier, right, when we discussed this last session, there was only one group. There was no control and treatment group. We just had those 25 kids, and we were just looking at a before-after effect, correct? Before, their average was 30%, and after, their average was 70%. They may not be comparable, other things are happening, all those problems, right? The argument is that if in fact you have a somewhat similar group, which is called a control, similar to your treatment, then this can take care of all these threats to attribution at the same time. So how do we do that? Well, think of, let's draw a graph. Let's chart kind of outcomes over time, right? So outcomes, which is the group average, right? In this case, you could think of maths, right? Performance on a test or some kind of maths skill over time, right? But for the group. So you start at some point in time, and that becomes your so-called baseline, and then you start your program, right? The program starts at some point at which you see, before you actually run your program, what is the situation like, right? What's your outcome like? And then what you do is you track your treatment group, those who get your program, over time, right? And let us say their outcome keeps improving over time, because your program is making more and more difference over time. And then at some point when your program stops, you call it the end line, correct? And so the problem is your outcome level at the baseline, which is this height, and your outcome level at the end line, which is this height, right? So the difference is this much, correct? Because your baseline is here and your end line is here. So if you can see my cursor, this much is the difference in height. That's the before after, but the problem is all of that may not be due to your program, correct? And so what you do now is create another group called the control group, and you track the change in outcome of your control group also over time. And suppose the control group ends up with this level of outcome, right? Outcome is the vertical axis. Then what you do is say that this difference in end line between your control and treatment is a better measure of the impact of the program, right? I think intuitively we are all familiar with this, but I just thought we make sure that we are all on the same page on this, right? So now, unlike in the example earlier, we are introducing a second group, and then we are saying that we are going to track that second group, which is not getting our program, And then instead of looking at before, after for our treatment group, we will instead look at difference in N-line outcomes for our treatment and control groups. And what is the advantage of this? The advantage of this is that suppose in fact there is the history threat, which is to say kids are going to coaching center, right? Or are getting parental help at home, and that's helping with their maths. Well, your control group will, after all, you're sort of taking a similar group, right? So your control group will also be going to coaching centers to some extent, will also be getting parental help at home. And so the fact that the control group, now just look at the blue, the control group is also improving outcome over time, correct? They're not getting your program. They're not getting a remedial maths program. And that's because other things are helping. So as long as what's happening to your treatment group because of coaching center or parental help or for that matter, class 6 teaching, correct? Class 6 regular teaching, you had mentioned, could also, all these things are history threat. These are other events which coincide, right? In terms of time, coincide with your program. So what you're doing is you're neutralizing that effect by saying, yeah, the control group will also have all that. So I'm netting that out, right? So rather than taking this height, I'm only taking this height. And therefore, my history threat has been completely taken out, right? This is the great kind of conceptual breakthrough in taking the control and comparing it with the treatment, right? I'm showing it graphically, but I think for many of us, it's intuitively, it's right. So by taking a control, we are allowing for the history threat to wash out in both the groups. And we are only taking the difference. Similarly, think of the other threats, the maturation threat, correct? So these kids are getting better at language, there's biological maturation, social maturation, but that's true for your control group kids as well. So maybe maturation can explain this increase for the control group. Well, so again, you're netting it out, correct? So the fact that the blue line is increasing could be because of history. Some other event is improving their math scores. It could be because of maturation. It could be any of our threats, correct? It could be our a test priming threat, which is, oh, they're getting better at taking test. Well, that's true for your control as well. So as long as all those things which were potentially problematic, as long as they all happen in your control as well, you're okay, because you're taking all that out and then seeing what is the change, right? So in short, at one fell swoop, by taking a control group, at one fell swoop, we are getting over all our 5 threats at the same time. Doesn't matter if they're going for coaching, doesn't matter if class 6 teaching is very good, doesn't matter if their class 5 and class 6 final exams are not strictly comparable. That's all okay, because that's equally true for your control. So even after factoring all that, if the control and treatment are different at end line, then you have, right, intuitively, you're much more confident. You've taken care of all that and still there's a difference. It must be because of your program. Right? That's really what people think as is the power of this kind of thing. Now, of course, the question is, where do you get this control group from? How do you know the control group is that similar, right, to your treatment? This is the big question. So a lot of impact evaluation, the effort is in trying to generate what they call an equivalent group, which is your control, right? It's hard. How do you know what's an equivalent group? That is why, the randomized control trial, I think you're all informally at least familiar with it, has so much kind of influence, because how do they create their control in the RCT, the randomized control trial, they randomly pick. So imagine, right, for a moment, that out of your 25 kids who the school thought needs some extra maths, suppose the school decides that we are going to randomly pick 12 of those 25 kids and we are going to give up the remedial maths program only to randomly selected 12 kids out of the 25. And the other 13, right, we are going to make them our control. They're not going to get our remedial maths and we are just going to track them. Right? Now, there are all kinds of issues here, ethical issues. There are many potential issues, but the idea of randomizing suggests that on average, those 12 and those 13 must be similar, correct? Because you're randomly picking. So there's a, I think intuitively we have a sense that they must be balanced, right? They must be, the number and the two need not be the same, by the way. You could take 15 kids for your treatment randomly and the rest 10 you could leave as your control because you're only looking at averages, right? So the point is, if you randomize, you're probably going to get equivalent groups. But there are many other issues, right? But I'm just saying intuitively, that is one of the reasons why people see randomization as a good way to create a good control. But that's not the only way to create a control, right? Sorry, yeah, there are other ways. Remember, control is simply some group which you think is similar to your treatment, whether or not it's created through randomization. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Nani. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to be very vocal about my concerns with randomized control trial that
Yeah.
actually,
But hold on.
Leaving it to probability.
No, we need to have a fuller discussion of RCT. So I'm not introducing, I'm just saying
Yeah.
the RCT is one way of creating a control. And intuitively, the control that the RCT creates is, you can see, I think most people's intuition would say it must be similar because anybody could be on this group or that group, correct? If you go into any class and you actually randomly pick kids, it's not easy to randomly pick, right? You might sort of say, oh, you come. That's not random, right? That's sort of ad hoc. So there's a way. Randomization really means you kind of blind yourself almost, right? And you say, I'll pick number 1, 7. You randomly throw some numbers out and pick. Otherwise, you might end up picking kids in the front row or the back row, or some kids who are making more noise or less noise, right? But if you do randomization well, the intuition is they must be similar because you could be picked, you could not be picked. So they ought to be similar, correct? If that's worth discussing, if you don't agree with that intuition. There are many other things about RCT which we have to discuss. But the fact that RCTs can give us an equivalent group, that's not the only way. There could be other ways, right, of creating an equivalent group. Right? That's the point here. So, for example, what could be another equivalent group since we discussed our so imagine that the school is going through with this policy, right, of taking all 25 who scored less than 50%, right, in class 5. This was the criteria I gave last time. In your class 5 final exam, if you scored less than 50% in maths, then the school puts you into, oh, you need extra maths, right? That's the school's decision. And they found that there are 25 such kids. Right now, can you think of within the same school, can you generate a control group? Suppose you said, look, all the other kids who got more than 50% in class 5, they are my control. This is, I think, this had come up in our last session. I had suggested, no, they're different, right? Because on average, they did better. So how can you say they're equivalent, correct? Any thoughts on, can you generate a control without randomizing? Control meaning an equivalent group.
Does a school have sections?
Okay, now we can, since it's a hypothetical school, let us give the school sections.
ठीक है. If there's section A, section B, and section A and B are not divided on the basis of that, A gets all the cream and B gets all the social rejects. So
right.
maybe, we can just say that in one section, we
We run the program in one section, but not in the other section.
not in the other section.
Yeah, there could be ethical and many other problems, right, with this, right, which is, see, the issue of ethics keeps coming back
Yeah.
in many interventions, so we do intend to do it, to discuss it properly, but
Yeah.
that aside, that big one aside, this could be an issue, right? If the school actually somewhat randomizes kids between sections A and B, and the kids who did poorly in class 5 in section A get your treatment,
Yeah.
then the kids who did poorly in section B become your control. But the problem is, of course, can you really imagine what the parents of the class B
Yeah.
kids are going to,
Of course.
right? Yeah, right. So there are political and ethical problems, right?
Right. Yeah.
With doing this. So that could be one. Any other way of generating a control group?
Could be in another school. It's totally.
Yeah, right. That could be. Now, of course, a comparable school loosely, right? Whatever that means. Say this is a government school of one sort, maybe another government school or whatever, right? You have to find some criteria which you think matter from establishing similarity, right? And this is all gets tricky, right? Somebody will say, oh, why those criteria, some other criteria, right? But that could be a solution, as Seema is saying. Take another cohort of class 5 kids from somewhere else. But Seema, you'll have to look at those kids there who did not do well, correct?
Yeah, and then of course teachers and resources and all those parameters.
Even the teachers should be comparable. Even the resources should be. So this is.
It gets tricky.
This is a tricky exercise.
Yeah.
Quite tricky.
Any other solutions? But these are all good, though imperfect controls, right? One of the big problems is many of our organizations, when we do this kind of evaluation, we don't do any control. We just do before, after, often. And that's really problematic, correct? That's because of all those threats. So we need to have some kind of control, but the problem is establishing a good control is never easy. Sorry, Rakesh, I think you're about to say something.
Also, Suraj,
Yeah.
Ria has shared a good experience in the chat box.
Right.
Yeah, so actually, while I was listening, so in 2019, we were doing this program. We started with it and we were working in 100 schools. So, so we just divided them into hub schools, control schools, and it just kind of struck me that there was no basis on which, it was done, because we were given the schools by the government itself, and there was no, this kind of thinking around this.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it's tricky. Even if you think systematically, it's tricky. But not doing it is then might as well not have control, right? Because what is that? Then maybe before after is less problematic. I mean, who knows? We know it's problematic, but this could be even more problematic, right? Suppose you end up with really different schools, but right. So yeah. So some kind of justification. The problem is we are dealing with very imperfect kind of logistics. So the justification to say, like Seema said, oh, it's that other school, a bit different, but for such and such reason, I think they're comparable, right? You have to make that case, which is why RCT types are in a really good position. They don't have to make any case. They just say we randomized, so they're equivalent, right? Here we have to say, oh, no, those hub schools are similar. Oh, we went there. There's, this, that, we whatever. You have to, here's their track record. Oh, this school also did not have a biology teacher. This school also did not. You'll have to do all kinds of matchings, and still you're not sure, right? So this is a tricky one. As we're talking, I also have not thought much about it, but it occurs to me, how about the following control, which is, so remember in our school, 75 kids got more than 50% in their maths, right? Class 5. So they're not in your program. Out of those 75, and we know that those 75 on average are not comparable with these 25, correct? However, out of those 75, suppose you pick the ones who barely scraped above 50.
Oh.
Correct? Those who got 50, 55 or so. right? Now, could you not argue that that subset is more similar? Of course, they're not the same. After all, they did score higher. But at least then you're taking out the ones who scored very high, right? Who are particularly not comparable. Right? So you could take a subset and say, look, these are a little more comparable. After all, these got a little more, got a little less. And so, in fact, that is one of the impact evaluation techniques. There's a fancy term for that. It's called regression discontinuity. But the point is, we have to come up with imaginative ways, right, to establish similarity. Okay. Since you're all sitting in Bengal, let me tell you of a famous such study that Maitrish Ghatak and Abhijit Banerjee did many years back for Bengal. You know, they wanted to know what's the impact of Operation Barga, which is the famous land reform movement of Jyoti Basu's government in late 70s, right? Where sharecroppers in Bengal, Bargadars, were given much better conditions. This is a very famous program, of course, not in education, but big program. They wanted to know how much impact did that program have. What they did was they compared it with neighboring districts of Bangladesh. Because they said similar culture, similar history, but in Bangladesh, they did not have that, because it's a different country. They didn't have, right? In Bengal, the state government did this program, but they said, but Bengal, at least those districts of West Bengal, which neighbor districts of Bangladesh, let's just focus on these two because they're pretty similar. And they tried to make that argument, except that in Bangladesh, they didn't get that treatment, right? So, and then they tracked these two. And then they said, oh, that's a reasonable control group. This is my treatment group. And right, so you have to come up with imaginative ways of creating controls. Of course, these are imperfect controls, right? Because Bangladesh is a different country. There might be other things different about it, even if they have some similar history and culture and so on. So, but the point is we can get better and better at creating controls, even though it won't be perfect. Right, and it would be an interesting exercise to take, like for example, the program that Ria was mentioning, and see, okay, maybe the government gave you this, so you didn't have, but suppose you were able to kind of zero in and say, I'm going to take these and these are a little more comparable for such and such reason. I think we can do this kind of thing. So I see Vaishali has another suggestion in the chat box. The new class 5 joinees as the treatment. So you mean kids who are 1 year younger?
Yes. Do you think that's a possibility that the new batch that is coming in is made the treatment group and we just compare the performance?
No, so then what is the control group? So the treatment group, of course, has to be treated. You mean you make the new batch the control is what you mean, I think, right?
No.
The control doesn't get treated. The treatment group are the kids in class 6 who are getting your remedial maths, correct?
Yeah.
So I think what you mean is the class 5 kids are your control.
No, what I was trying to say is that we give the remedial classes to the, one batch junior, which is now in the 5th standard, and compare those two. But then that won't be like an RCT, will it be?
No, forget RCTs. We are not right now after RCT. We just want comparable groups, right? So what are we after? Remember, look, let's go back to this diagram which is open, right? If we only had one group, which is our red group, treatment group, which is what we discussed last time, then what are we left with? We have an end line and a baseline. The baseline is our pre-test, our class 5 final exam result, and our end line is our post-test, which is our class 6 final exam result. And we are saying, oh, on average, it's 70 minus 30, 40. We are saying that's not great because there are all kinds of other things which could be happening. Therefore, we want a control group is basically some other group, which is similar to our treatment group, except that that group does not get our treatment. Correct? So now.
Got it. Yeah.
So I think if I were to slightly modify your suggestion, you could take a control group, which is your new class 5. But the problem is, are they really comparable to the class 6?
Yeah, that's why.
Unless you say those in class 5 who are not doing too well, Maybe they are, of course, they're 1 year behind, but maybe they're comparable. I think that's not bad. It's yeah. So we have to now sift through, and see what's a good.
Maybe it will apply the TAL strategy, teach them at the right level.
Yeah, TAL, of course, was meant to be a solution to this. Yeah. TAL, we'll come back to TAL because TAL has got a lot of documentation. They did some RCTs around it. But like I said, we'll come back to RCT because it's a kind of topic on which many people have many opinions. But right now, we're only looking at RCT as one of many ways of generating control. That's it. Yeah. All right. So now, now I want to ask a second question, right? So we agree that in principle, if you have a good control, right? The problem is logistically, how do we create a good control? But conceptually, suppose we have got a good control, then it can simultaneously take care of all our threats at the same time. Correct? I hope you sort of agree with the intuition of that, which is what we were trying to discuss with that diagram, that graph. So let me just pause there to see if there are. So we're keeping aside the question of how do we create a good control, right? We did some brainstorming and going back to that point about if we have a good control, then the difference in outcome between control and treatment on average is a pretty good estimate of my program effect, because all my threats are happening in control as well, so they wash out because I'm only taking the difference between the two groups. And that's the logic. I think Seema has, Seema, please.
Yeah, will mortality be handled?
Yeah.
I mean, out of those threats, mortality is still a challenge.
So since you're raising that, why don't we look at each of them and see why it still doesn't fully answer, right? Let's start with the history, and I think mortality is particularly important, but let's see the way in which I listed them, history. So we'll come to mortality number 3. So now, just to be clear, we are saying that at one shot, all of these are more or less handled, but as Seema is suggesting, they may not be fully handled. So can you think of a reason why the history threat may not be fully taken care of? So now I'm sort of deliberately, at first I said, look, it washes out. So it's good. Now I'm saying it doesn't quite fully wash out. So let's start with the history threat. What can you think of a plausible scenario where an event happens to your treatment group which does not happen to your control, or which happens to your control but does not happen to your treatment? Remember the kinds of examples you gave in the last session. Let's take the coaching center example, right? So the hope is, the kids in control go to coaching, and the kids in treatment go to coaching. So the coaching effect is nullified. Any further difference between the two groups must be because of my remedial maths program, right? That's the logic. But can you think of why coaching might be different between the two groups?
I mean, one of the reasons that we also explored, Suraj, was that so because these kids scored so low, parent-teacher meetings must have happened. The parents would have been, alerted about the situation. Maybe coaching was their way of finding a solution to the problem. So maybe only the
True, but that's true for control also, right? So imagine we created the control. So control also have similarly bad scores, right? They're equivalent. So they would also have been concerned, correct? Your point. So imagine the control was created like you suggested, Naini, by class B, section B students who are doing not well, right? They are not getting a program, right? There are ethical and political issues. Right. So but those kids also did not do well in class 5. Their parents are concerned. The school is not going to only call class, right? They're going to, it's just that they're not giving section B students the program, right? In the scenario you sketched out. But this issue of concern, if I'm a class section B parent, I'd be concerned. In fact, I'd be upset with the school. Oh, you're not giving my kid the just because I'm not in section A, well, but I'd be concerned, right? So in a way that's taken care of. But sort of what you're saying, what I was thinking of was, suppose the remedial maths program is you have to stay 2 hours more, right? And that interferes with coaching, right? So if you do remedial maths, maybe logistically it's not possible to do as much coaching center, right? This is only so many hours in a day. Kid is tired. Kid also needs to play, right? So many parents might decide, acha, you're getting remedial maths, fine, problem solved, right? I'm not going to, on top of that, work with them at home, or I'm not going to overkill. While control group parents might think, okay, our kids are in trouble, they're in, right? After all, they're equivalent. So let's, and there's time because they're not getting any remedial maths. So those kids might get more remedial, more coaching center or more parental thing, right? So it now depends on the details of the situation. So, right. So we're just thinking of plausible stories, hypothetical situations. So it's possible that the history threat doesn't get completely washed out because this doesn't work equally between the two. You know, in a very famous example given in the US, they said that there was some remedial maths program which happened to be running in the school at the same time that Sesame Street, this famous children's program, which also teaches some maths by the by, you know, it's fun. And so the kids who were in the remedial maths program, since the Sesame Street was playing on TV at the same time, only the control group kids at home could watch it. And therefore they learned maths because they happened to be at home and they could see Sesame Street. Right? So now it just happened that at the same time something happened, you know. So therefore the history threat worked differently between the two. Right? So this is just to say that just because you have a control, even if it's a randomized control or any other way of generating a control, you still have to be a little careful. You still have to work out, at least intuitively, okay, whatever I was thinking was happening, you know, outside my program, which is affecting things, is it happening about similarly between the two groups? One is to say, because I've got a control, I'm somewhat confident that it washes out, which is what I said earlier. Now I'm complicating it by saying, still I should try to follow up, because it could be that coaching center is happening more in my control simply because they have time and energy, right? So then it's an issue. Similarly, is it possible that my maturation threat works differently between the two groups? Again, you'll have to tell stories, right? Again, the first shot is to say, look, they're similar, so things work similarly, right? Which is why having a control sort of protects you. But suppose I were to make up a story such as the maturation threat is, the maturation happens because these kids now go out to play, right? Games, or they go out to shops and things like that. But the kids who are in the program, they don't have the time for all that, correct? Because they're stuck in the after school program. But these other controlled school kids are getting these other influences. So maybe their social maturation is different, and that might affect, right? Of course, I'm not thinking this is a big thing, even the way I'm talking, but the point is, you'll have to sort of follow up and see whether, in fact, these threats work differently in the two groups. The starting point, like I said, is that by having a good control, you're hoping that everything washes out, but you still want to sort of check a little bit. Yeah. Coming to the third of these, the mortality, which is the point that Seema had raised, right? Could it be that the dropouts between the treatment and control are different, right? And what would it mean? So now one is dropping out from the program, the other is dropping out from the test. Yeah. So Seema, can you work us through why you think the mortality threat might work differently between the two groups, at least hypothetically?
See, somebody, you know, dropping out of the control group, right? And your control group is usually, is it usually smaller than your treatment group? Or not necessarily?
The good news is they're roughly similar, you know, because we don't want some other sample
That's-
size effects to affect these, but
Okay.
they don't have to be the same. Could be a little more,
Yeah.
these are called
So-
unbalanced samples. It doesn't matter
Hmm.
because we're only looking at the average after all, right?
Yeah.
So, but why should the dropouts from control be systematically different from dropouts from program? I would think it's the other way around,
Mhm.
which is to say, see, you have a program. Oh, this kid, oh, their parents can't pick them up after remedial every day. So some kids drop out because of, right?
Logistic
Control,
issues.
yeah, but control, nothing is happening to them, right? So there's nothing
Yeah.
to drop out from because you're not giving them anything. You're just tracking them. The only
Yeah.
way to drop out is if you leave that entire area and you actually can't reach those kids to measure, right? Failing that, you're just tracking them irrespective of everything. So
Mortality either ways, even if you don't use a control group, is still a challenge. I mean, as far as your indicator is just an average, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That we are
Exactly.
only doing a class average of 5th standard or 6th standard, irrespective of, what was the size of the baseline sample or an endline sample.
Yes. So now think about it. Yeah, just to follow that line of thought, right? So you sort of agree that control, there's no real issue of dropout. Dropping out is more likely from a program because they can't do it, or there's some small payment or various reasons why you can't actually, right, do a program. Right. So typically dropouts are more in treatment for this reason. Now, when can that become a problem, right, for our purpose? It can become a problem if those who are dropping out are systematically different from those who are staying on. So suppose your dropouts are the kids who are finding even the remedial maths class too difficult, right? So they're alienated, they're feeling depressed or something, right? Because there's something they need something else, and the rest of the kids are managing the remedial maths. But so suppose right, so in which case the ones who are dropping out are not comparable with the ones who are staying on. In which case your treatment effect that you're estimating, so the kids who are getting treated are not comparable to the kids in the control, because the kids who are getting treated are a little better, because the real bottom, so to speak, I mean, this is really harsh language, but one group has,
but could be, the cream also drops out.
It could be the other way around. So that's exactly right. So since we're coming up with stories, we can give, which is why in any real world program, you have to actually see what's happening. So now let's think of the other kind of story that Seema is suggesting, which is, suppose there are kids who are actually finding this remedial maths class boring. They're really, actually, they're getting it. And it's so boring that they're dropping out. They're actually good. Right? Somehow they scored badly in the class 5 exam and they got stuck in this program, but they're actually, somehow they pull themselves and they're leaving because they're too good somehow. In which case, again, your treatment and your control are not comparable, but then now for the ulta reason, right? So just because there are dropouts by itself is not an issue. The issue is if your dropouts are different from the ones who are not dropping out. Right? If dropouts are random, for example, right, then you're okay, because but if in fact it's in one end of some distribution, that the kid, this end or that end, then you get into an issue, right? So
is there an acceptable percentage? I'm coming to this point because recently, of course, Riti, who is there in this team, was also part of that program. We had a baseline, we had done some 5-6 months back for language and numeracy for about 200 students. And we had an end line being done after the learning camps that we conducted, and last month we did the end line. And I roughly saw that about 18% of the students who took the baseline were not there in the end line, and an additional 15% were there. So the sample size of the baseline end line is not, it's not a big difference. It's just like 195 or a 206 type of thing, right? But how do you do an impact in such a thing?
So one immediate thing you should do is take out the 15 and 18 and do only, right, at least
analyze
for the subsample who was common.
Okay.
If it's not too different, then adding gives you the advantage of statistical power without affecting. That could be a simple kind of rule of thumb thing.
Yeah.
There's another technique, but so these are specifics. We'll come to
Yeah,
these maybe separately.
we tried
There
to
are-
do the class average as well as we did the normal distribution curve to see, you know, where your sigma 1, sigma 2, sigma 3 fall. So
Yeah, but that's making a lot of assumptions, right, about the distribution. But there are other kind of intuitive checks you can do, you know. Yeah, but this is getting maybe a bit specific. We can discuss
okay,
that
yeah,
separately.
yeah.
But the bigger point is exactly your worry is the important one. Oh, okay, you know, I have a sense that those who I'm adding maybe similar, right? And here's the reason why, right? I mean, so you have to tell stories is the important. This can't be solved statistically, right? Because the statistical solving also requires hidden assumptions. One way or the other, you have to have some reason why you think they are comparable, right? Whether they're dropping out or some history threat is happening. So I'll focus on that conceptual thing. There are little statistical things you can do as kinds of things you're pointing out, but those maybe yeah, that we can take maybe separately because those are finer matters, let's say. But those also will not work if we get this stuff. If we get our stories wrong, then the statistical fineness may not help. So let's focus on this. And luckily, yeah, you don't need any statistics for this, right? This is the good thing. This is just we just have to have a intuition for the idea. Then of course some statistics can help a little bit. Yeah. So far so good. Instrumentation threat. Yeah, the problem with instrumentation threat is that you can never be sure that two different tests are really similar, right? You want to make levels of learning competencies, this that you try, right? The question Rakesh had asked earlier also, what are the criteria? But you can never be quite sure. So there's always that. And could it be that the priming test works differently in the two? See, all of these are possible. You'll have to think of stories. So in fact, right now we are just making up stories to suggest that, oh, the history threat works differently or the dropouts work differently, right? But at the end of the day, for any particular program, like the program that Seema and others were mentioning, right, this 200 kids kind of thing. So without knowing the context, it's hard to know whether your control is really working or whether the kind of, you know, sometimes we do some band-aids, right? Some shortcuts, like you're saying 18% dropped out, does that, you add another 15%. So it's whether that is justifiable or not depends on knowing the context, right? So just because 18% dropped out, is it a problem? Can't say. Depends on whether they are representative or not of the other 82, right? Or if you add 15%. So knowledge of context is very important for this. But so, okay. So in the literature, what we just now discussed are called selection threats. That is, even with two groups, control and treatment, it's possible that the history threat works slightly differently because maybe the control group parents go more for coaching center and the treatment group kids not able to because the program takes too long time, or I mean, whatever the stories we are telling, or the dropout story that Seema was suggesting, it can lead to a mismatch between the two groups for the threat. It's still a second order. So in case there is a little bit of confusion, let me just step back and say, by and large, having an equivalent group, which we are calling a control, right, whether through randomization or through other ways, by and large helps a lot, right? It's better than simple before after. But we can't rest easy because we still have to slightly check whether our controls, whether the threats are working similarly in our control and our treatment. Right? So it's a second order thing, but it's worth checking. I'm now going to pick up what are called another set of threats. One is the what's called the diffusion imitation or spillover effect, which is in the case of our remedial maths program, it could be that after all, these kids are in the regular class, they're all together, right? It's just that some are staying, the 25 of them are staying on for the extra, but every day, for most of the day, they're hanging out together. They're in the same room, right? Until the school is officially over and the remedial program starts. So it could be that these 25 kids, they chat with the other kids, right, who are in your control. So imagine your control is the kind of thing that M&E suggested, which is you're giving your treatment only to section A kids who've done poorly in class 5, and you're withholding your program to section B kids who've done poorly in class 5, right? If you do that, then you have a potentially reasonable control. But these kids, your section A kids who are getting your program, might chat every day and tell, oh, yesterday in the remedial maths program, we did this, or we use this cool app and we learned this or that. And so it gets diffused, it spills over. And so the kids in your control are also indirectly getting a little bit of your treatment. Yeah, does that make sense? So to the extent that this is happening, will it lead to an overestimation or an underestimation of your program effect? I hope the diffusion effect is clear, right? Even the kids who are in your control might indirectly get your treatment because they're all part of the same milieu, same school, they chat, right? So first of all, is it a problem? It is a problem because your control is not control anymore. Your control is getting a little bit of treatment, correct? Yeah, you agree with my example, right? Some of the kids in your control, the section B kids who are supposed to not be in your program, and they are not in your program, but they pick up some of this. After all, it's the same school. It's their other friends from section A who are getting the program. So they chat, discuss, they get some of it.
The example is clear, Suraj, but I mean, the thing is that some of these threats that you're talking about, it might be very difficult to account for all the variables and to, for example, prevent those lunchtime discussions where you share.
I'm not saying prevent. All I'm asking is, does it lead to an over or underestimation of your program effect? We are not trying to control anything here. Huh? So we're just thinking, suppose you have a control group and a treatment group, and you're just, what can we learn from them about the effect of our program, right? That's what we're trying to do. So I'm just saying that it's natural that they'll chat over lunchtime. So it's natural that this will happen. So my question is simply asking, how does that interfere with our impact evaluation, correct? Are we going to end up getting a bigger estimate than real or a smaller estimate than real? That's what I'm asking.
I would say it's underestimation because even the other class is benefiting indirectly from the remedial.
Exactly, right? So the diffusion leads to underestimate. If your diffusion, if there is diffusion, and we shouldn't prevent it, that'll lead to all kinds of, right? Whatever diffusion there is probably a good thing, right? From the school's perspective, but it's a bad thing from our evaluation perspective because it, and what it's doing is exactly what M&E is saying, which is your actual impact is bigger, but because your control is also getting bumped up, so the difference looks smaller than it actually is. So it's right. So the actual effect is even more. The second is the compensatory rivalry, which is the class section B kids who are in control. They get really miffed. Oh, we were not chosen. We will show that even without a program, we will do well. I think previously I used the Eklavya story in the Mahabharata to show this, right? That's compensatory rivalry. Who are not getting the treatment, well, I will show them, right? So the fact that you're being denied the treatment, right, is actually making you
I'm muting him and he's
yeah. So right. On the other hand, it could lead to resentful demoralization, which is the ulta effect, which is, I'm in control. Oh, they didn't even I'm not doing well, they still didn't give me any help, or I'm no good, whatever, right? They might go into a spiral where they will do even worse than they would normally do without treatment, right? So these are what I call social interaction threats, right? Because of my status and control, because I'm assigned to not getting the program, that's making me compensate, right? Out of some kind of revenge, or it gets my Josh up, or it gets my Josh down, right? Either way, it's because of my assignment to control, right? So compensatory rivalry will lead to under or overestimation of the program effect. That's to say, so kids who are in control, they decide because they're in control, we're going to show them, we're going to do well, we're going to show the principal that even without your program, we'll study hard, right? Will that lead to an underestimation? It will lead to an underestimation of the program effect, right? Because basically the program is leading the control group to get bumped up, either because of diffusion or because they decide, like Eklavya, that we'll show them.
This factor you're talking about, that compensatory one, it is very interesting because in our setup, basically we are trying to work work on learning outcome, but at the same time teachers are part of the in a part of the loop. So sometimes teachers also get affected because you are reaching these people better than us. So the resentment sometimes comes from not only from children, but the teachers also do get affected, which
very
might
interesting,
ultimately,
right? And if it affects teachers, that might have a multiplier effect, because teachers can really kind of guide the class, right? It might multiply into the students because of the power that teachers might have. That's very interesting. That leads me to this third one, which is connected also, Rakesh, with what you're saying: compensatory equalization. Because in the real world, often what happens, again, let's go back to the control that Naini suggested. Section B students who are not doing well are control. Section A students who are not doing well are program treatment. Yeah.
Suraj,
So
compensatory rivalry will lead to underestimation.
right.
What about the resentful demoralization? How does that lead to
Opposite.
underestimation?
No. Resentful demoralization leads to overestimation.
Overestimation, right?
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and this, exactly, right? So I'm just saying they are the opposites of each other. Compensatory rivalry, the Josh works positively for the first, negatively for the second. But either way, the Josh is because of my placement and control, right? And therefore, the effect, will go the other way, underestimation, overestimation. So I was coming to this point about compensatory equalization. So in this case, the parents will complain, how come my child is not getting, and so on. And so very often what happens is we give something else. The principal might say, okay, I'm going to arrange extra music classes for the kids in section B. I'll give them something, right? So that to mollify, maybe extra language or something. And that's often the case because it's very hard to create a very strict control, especially within the same small environment like a school, right? It's not politically or ethically. There are many reasons why it's hard. And so oftentimes what we do is we give some people the program, but then we do this kind of compensation. So imagine it's a compensatory music program or sports program, right? We give something else to those kids, to say, right? The problem is that compensation might also somehow affect the control group, often in ways which will lead to underestimation of the program effect, right? Because if they're learning music, maybe that's helping them with maths. If they're doing sports, maybe that's improving their self-confidence, and that's helping them with maths, right? So often, so Rakesh, the example, maybe some of the teachers are doing other things to make up, right? Because after all, you have to justify, and it's hard. So compensatory rivalry could happen with teachers, but also equalization might be happening. It's not exactly equal, but some kind of compensation.
Suraj, I have a very like a kind of question. Can I ask now?
Yeah, please.
So these kind of threats we are talking about right now, are they all applicable to all kind of sample sizes, or like these are more like acute in terms when it comes to small like target group? Because I can bring an example from my experience. Azim Premji Foundation used to conduct a large scale assessment for all the children like grade 3, 5, 8. So when I was there, we had the two groups, like one control group, and then we used to select children from the districts where we used to work. Our presence were there, foundation's presence were there. So the sample size was so big, and you go to a neighboring district with a similar profile, and you get a control group sample. So in that case, are these threats are actually applicable?
Yeah. So I think it's a very good question. So for one thing, this last set of the social interaction threats, right? Whether it's diffusion or especially the compensatory rivalry or all that, that works only, first of all, if you know that you're in the program, correct? Oftentimes, it might be part of a larger package, and so people may not even realize that, oh, I'm missing one particular thing, right? This is, by the way, I'll come back to Rakesh, your example, but this is particularly true for example, of medical kind of drugs, right? So you come up with a new pill which is supposed to address some disease or some sickness, but the control group, you can give a placebo, right? Some other pill, and so nobody will know which is whether they're getting the real treatment or they're getting the placebo, right? So there are ways in many kinds of programs to hide the fact that people in the program don't know that they are in the program, right? Especially in kind of medical interventions. Not easy in surgeries and so on, but in many kinds of situations, it's possible. In education programs, often less, but sometimes it can still happen because it's part of a larger program. So people may not realize that they're in or out for a particular thing that you're evaluating. Right, that's one. The second is, if in fact, as Rakesh is saying, the control and treatment are somewhat distant, right? Then it's harder for the kind of social interaction threats to work, right? If it's another district and so on, then, as opposed to you're in the same school, or you're seeing those kids are getting it, you're not getting it, right? The rivalry or the compensatory the compensation that the school provides, the school has to, because it's managing all these parents. But if in fact the groups are fairly separate, then your social interaction threats are less problematic, right, Rakesh? The kinds of things you are describing. Oh, it's in some other district, you're studying some control, then that distance allows the interaction to be less. On the flip side, the more distance they are, the more you might wonder whether that control is equivalent to your treatment, right? You could say, oh, that district is not the same as this district, so that control is not as good. You see, so distance does allow social interaction threats to reduce, but it might also compromise equivalence. Rakesh, does that? I don't know if I've...
Yeah. Of course, it cannot be completely.
Yeah. So sometimes we do this. We go a little bit away, right? So especially with the diffusion, So because sometimes just physical proximity makes things diffuse. So you might want to go a little farther to reduce diffusion. But the farther you go, you run into this other issue, right? Of reducing comparability. So that's a kind of a balance or a trade-off which we have to keep in mind. Okay. Yeah, maybe I actually meant to take stock. Are we all doing okay on this? We are, I think I did introduce some terms. You could say some of this discussion is a little technical, but if it's getting a little much, I would just say step back and just be sure to appreciate that the bigger point that impact evaluation is making, which is in order to know what changes in the world, in society, in classrooms are due to my program, often just a before after is insufficient. I need actually to compare similar groups and track similar groups, right? And then all our discussion was how to interpret similar groups, because they might still not be similar enough. All these other things are happening, all the stuff on this slide, right? All the complications that could happen. But the big picture is that having an equivalent, roughly equivalent control really goes a long way in getting you set up for impact attribution to your program, right? That's the big thing, but often not fully. So especially the kinds of things that you were mentioning, that the government gave some control or this or that, you might want to really dig deeper and see, what might compromise comparison. Right? That's the context in which all of these things are mentioned. So I have a few more things to say about this, but let me just check with you. Are you all doing okay on this? Or, I mean, we are so surrounded by this kind of language, right? Control, treatment, and line baseline, that somehow, it's hard not to pick it up. But the trouble, exactly what I think Ria was saying, which is it's easy to get bad controls, right? You have to work hard and you have to justify, first of all, to yourself that, yeah, this is equivalent. On what basis do we create equivalence is difficult. So I'm going to give you another example for this, right, which we can discuss, right? Is it a good group, not a good group? Why do you think it's comparable, not comparable, kind of thing, right? So the more example, so I think when we do our in-person workshop at some point in some months, we can actually pick up the programs that you're mentioning, and then we can really drill down and see those schools and those kids and ask what makes them comparable, not comparable. Right. But the point is, if you get reasonably comparable groups, you really can, mostly counter a lot of these threats. But you still want to do all these kind of second order things that I mentioned, right? Still check whether there are Eklavya things going on, or compensations going on, or differential dropouts, which can seriously create some problem, right? But these are all second order. First order is, if your control is decent, a lot of the things can be taken care of. Okay. So if that's fine, let me just move on to a few more things.
Suraj,
Yeah.
I don't know, matlab, you're talking about taking a stock. So I would just say that this is like a lot of material to think about. So it's a very good discussion it's been, but it would be helpful, at least for me, if in case no new concepts are introduced now. Can I
Okay.
request you for that?
All right. So let's do one thing. Okay. Actually, I did have. So why don't I skip this stuff? We can come back to it, right? Let me skip that slide. I'll come back to it. So there is a little bit more to. Well, actually, it's not that bad. So I think you'll see this is not new. I think I appreciate the point, Nani. Why don't you tell me whether this is new or not? I think it's the same logic. Okay. So I think you will find this. You will accept this.
I'm still caught in that attribution, misattribution, overestimation, underestimation.
Yeah, but that's calculations you can do, right? But the big point is, if they are equal, in what way are they unequal, right? Once we have a story for that, then you can work it out, right? I mean, then it's just a working out. So it is a new word, but in fact, this is what we've been doing. So I'm just going to tax your patience by just adding one more word, not too much. The idea is the same. There's nothing new beyond. It's just kind of going around it in different ways. This term is sometimes used counterfactual, which I think you will find useful as an thing for what we've been already discussing, which is what your treatment is the group which is actually, in fact, getting something, correct? And that's what you want to see. What's the impact of that thing that the treatment group is getting, right? Now, what you want, an ideal control, is what is called a counterfactual. That is to say, if we could rewind time and go back to our same group and not give them the program and then play, right? So in the real world, it's not possible. You can't have two alternative realities at the same time, right? So that's why this is called counterfactual. Counterfactual is not real, it's just a thought experiment. So imagine that you have 25 kids, right? And you're giving them compensatory maths. So you got your treatment group. Now imagine you could go back in time and those same 25 kids, you don't give them a program, right? Then that is your ideal control, right? Because they are the same kids,
Yeah.
right? So there's no issue of equivalence, correct? Of course, you can't do it. But this, so that's what I'm saying. What we have been discussing is really how to create a good counterfactual, right? So counterfactual is just a more sophisticated term for what we've been calling control, which is an equivalent group. A counterfactual is the perfect, but it's just in our minds because you can't have an alternate reality at the same time. So it's in our minds, the counterfactual is the best equivalent because it's the same group without the program. That's the perfect thing. But the problem is the data on the factual is not, the data on the factual is available. The data on the counterfactual by definition is not available, right? Because that's not a reality. So another way of putting all this, which is why Nani, I was saying this is not really anything different, is the real question is how do you create a good counterfactual? How do you create a good control, as we were saying earlier? I'm just using a fancier term, counterfactual, because that's the in terms of that's the sharpest way of putting it, right? So one is to say that the before is my counterfactual and my after is my factual, correct? In other words, I run my program and what happens to them is the factual, correct? So my after, my post test for my program kids, that is what happened. What we were doing was saying that the before is a reasonable counterfactual or control, correct? So when you don't have a separate control group, you're only doing before after, which is what we did last session. I said, 30% and 70%, correct? Same kids. Before your program, they were at 30%. Now they're at 70%. So you could take your 30% to be a control and your 70% to be your treatment. That's one way of interpreting it. Another is to take a separate group of kids, such as your section B kids versus your section A kids, or as Seema said, some other kids from some other school, or as I suggested, the kids who got 55, 60%, right? So the different ways you create a control and then they make your control the counterfactual. The first point here is make the before the counterfactual and the after the factual. Here you're making the control group, a separate physical group as the counterfactual, and your treatment group is the factual. You could also combine the two, which is you can do a controlled treatment two groups and you can track them for a before after. Right? You can do both simultaneously. You can take a control group and look at how they were performing earlier and later, even though they never got your program, but you can see how they were performing 1 year back and now. And then you can take your treatment group and look at how they were performing 1 year back and now, correct? So that's combining the control treatment with the before after. But I'll come back to this so I'm not sure, going by Nani's criteria, whether this is anything new, but the point the bigger point is that we are in search for getting good controls, or that the more correct term is counterfactuals, right? To which we compare the reality, the factual, which is the program that we run, right? So it's really a quest for a good counterfactual. One is to just take the before. It has problems. Another is to take a separate group control. It's okay, but we saw it. How do we really know they're equivalent? And the third I'm just saying is you can combine the two, before, after, and control treatment. Okay. Now let me. Okay, no more new stuff. We'll just go back to the example of TINP, right? To refresh your memory, it's been some weeks. TINP was the Tamil Nadu Integrated Nutrition Program. If you remember, we had discussed this quite a bit when we discussed theory of change, right? So they had this nutrition counseling. So it was a big experiment, big intervention in Tamil Nadu, 20,000 villages, with big World Bank. It was the biggest such program in the world at the time, 1980s. And so they did this nutritional counseling. They had this childcare, these women who are locally hired in these villages. They'd give these mothers training on, good nutrition practices. And then they would also give them some supplementary feeding. If you remember, we had discussed this quite in detail for theory of change, right? So in fact, let's look at impact evaluation for TINP. So you want to know what is the impact that this nutritional counseling and this feeding program had in Tamil Nadu. And this program ran in the 1980s. And so we want to see for the period 1982 to 90, here is some information, okay? Because they studied this quite a bit. On average, if you look at 6-month-olds in 1982 versus in 1990, their average weight increased by 360 grams, which is about 6.5%. Okay. And 36-month-olds, that is 3-year-olds, their weight on average increased by 650 grams, it's about 6.2%. So let me just pause there and just ask you, is this a good evidence that the program had good impact? Can you say the program impact is about 6%? I mean, or that these numbers, can you interpret this to mean that the program really had solid impact, or no, on the basis of what we've discussed so far? So remember, they're comparing 6-month-olds, right? Those who are 6-month-old in 1982 and those who are 6-month-old in 1990. They find that weights have increased 6%. They're also comparing 3-year-olds in 1982 and 3-year-olds in 1990. They find that the weight has increased by 6%.
This is like the same sort of a scenario which Vaishali had suggested, right? Where she was saying that if in case you take the new incoming 5th class batch as the control group.
Well, but there was an age difference. Here it's just at 2 different points in time, but they are similar kind of kids, right? These are both 6-month-olds. Vaishali was saying at one point in time, take 2 different cohorts. Correct. Here we are taking similar cohort, but at 2 different points in time. Correct. Because we can only compare 6-month-olds with because baby weights, because weight for age is important. Correct. Because with age, there are other reasons independent of your program, how weight would increase. So we are only looking at 6-month-olds. So this is not quite the same as what Vaishali was saying, but irrespective of that, my question is this a good or a problematic way of looking at impact? To say, oh, 6-month-olds earlier, they were weighing this much, but now after many years of running the program, your 6-month-olds, today's 6-month-olds are heavier.
I think it fairly good as per my understanding, because it's not only the percentage, the kind of indicators, weight and age. These indicators are really hard to break.
Yeah.
So
So you think this is reasonable way
Yeah.
of looking at impact? Yeah. But so what is the factual and counterfactual here? What are they comparing? They're comparing. The factual is the 1990, correct? Many years after running TINP.
Yeah.
What is the counterfactual? The 1982 numbers, which is the start of the program. Correct?
Yeah.
So in a sense, the counterfactual is the before and the factual is the after. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah. Yeah. 82 and 90. Yeah.
Correct?
Uh,
And what's the problem with before after?
that too, it's very hard to tell from.
Yeah, but there could be history threat.
Of course.
8 years, 8 years, correct? Many other things might have affected, right? How children are brought up. Wouldn't you say?
Of course. Yeah.
So then you could be misattributing to your program what might be something else which is happening, right? My point is to show, but first, well, before I get there, isn't what I've shown so far, this is a before after, wouldn't you say? So, right? I think Rakesh, you're agreeing, right? It's before after. Why? Because you're comparing 1982 ka 6-month-olds with 1990 ka 6-month-olds.
6-month, yeah.
The fact that they are 6-month-olds is a good thing, correct? As exactly what you're saying, Rakesh. It makes them comparable. But the problem is there could be other things which are coincident, right? Which are happening at the same time as TINP. So TINP is running 1983, 84, 85, right? All this. So that's good stuff. But who's to say that the equivalent of coaching centers in our other example is not happening here? Correct? And that might be what is lifting weights in 1990.
That's of course, and of course, I think when you compute that kind of timeline, then of course there will be other factors. And
yeah, so therefore, all our suspicions of before-after analysis should apply here, correct? Which is especially the history threat.
History.
Correct. Now, of course, we need to know the context more. 1980s, lots of things were happening all over India. This is where a lot of development yojanas were happening, health yojanas. This was where Tamil Nadu, especially, even more than other parts of India, a lot of things were happening, right? So there's reason to wonder, okay, what else was happening in that decade, which might have impacted kids' nutrition and weight, whether or not TINP happened. Right? That's a question we must ask. Agreed?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So another just roundabout way of saying what I've presented so far on the slide is actually before after. It looks persuasive, right? Rakesh, you are still half persuaded, I think, right? For very understandable reasons. But the moment you start asking, that's a good 8 years, 10 years. Can you really say that it's because of TINP, right? Many other things could be happening.
Actually, I'm thinking by that explanation, I think we can question any sort of development sector studies or impact assessment thing.
Which are before after, just to complete your sentence. We can question anything which is only before after.
Yeah.
Because unless the before after is very quick, correct? But when you're talking about an 8-year period, or in our remedial maths class, a 1-year period, right? Which is very crucial for a 10-year-old kid, right? That 1-year period. Then you're opening yourself to many other things which might have happened, and in which case you are confusing the effect of those other things with your program, right? That really compromises your ability to say that, oh, this is your program effect. I'm just saying the same thing in another way. Before, after is problematic. I think what is what Rakesh you are saying, correct? But if you are able to get a control group, then it can neutralize your history threat, all your threats, correct? Which is what we discussed just earlier.
Yeah.
And what I've shown on this slide, there is no control group. Would you agree?
Yeah. Control group presence could have been made it more validated or
Yeah,
strong.
correct. Yeah, that's the point. Okay, so let me now. What are the potential confounders? That is to say, this just okay. This may be slightly confusing. What are the other things which are coincident with your program? Right. Remember, for our remedial maths, what did we say? It could be. I think we came up with two solid, potential, very plausible things. Right. Coaching center and parental help at home. Correct. These were very realistic possibilities. And we all agreed that that can really make you end up overestimating your program effect, correct? Because in fact, these kids are doing better because they're going to coaching center. So that's a history threat. Something else is happening, an event which is coincident with your program. In the case of TINP, in fact, there were other programs. For example, the ICDS, Anganwadi program started in the late 70s and slowly ramped up. Okay, that could be a serious thing. Tamil Nadu government had a noon meal program, famously, MG Ramachandran and all, which is later, of course, now all over India we have this midday meal program. But Tamil Nadu is the one who spearheaded a lot of this, right? So that's why knowing the context matters. So these things are happening, happening at the same time as your TINP. PDS, the public distribution system, rations shops were expanding. Right? Now, it's quite possible that with all these, 6-year-old weight will increase. Families are eating better, right? Kids are getting noon meal. Of course, noon meal program is only for kids in school, but it could be that there is some spillover, right? There's leakage and all that. There are reasons why even smaller kids from those same families might benefit. And the ICDS program Anganwadi is meant for this kind of age group, right? So in fact, the 1980s was a time in which many other things were happening. In fact, the 1980s in Tamil Nadu was also a time in which not just these programs, all the things I've listed so far are programs, right? Which might have seriously impacted infant weight, right? 6-month-old or 36-month-old children's weight. So that's a serious history threat. On top of that, it's not just government yojanas, government programs. In fact, the 1980s was when Tamil Nadu had huge agrarian change, and agricultural incomes and agricultural mode of production, and this has been well documented for Tamil Nadu. That was when a lot of change happened. And so farmers' incomes changed, farmers' labor income changed. All of that might also have affected, right, what they're able to give their children. Right? And this is not a yojana specific thing. In short, one has to now look at what happened between your before and your after, right, which might have affected your program. Right? So there's good. Now, would you say, even if we don't know Tamil Nadu history well, just from what I've said, would you be somewhat persuaded, oh, all of this could have really, independent of TINP, I would expect all of this to have increased, 6-month-old kids' weight in that period, correct? Even without TINP, maybe weights would have gone up, because these are things which possibly really, would affect little kids' weight, right? Wouldn't you agree? This is quite plausible. This is like our coaching center or our parental thing, correct? This details. Would you agree or no? See, the thing is, right? This story is quite strong, wouldn't you say, even without knowing too much more? If in fact all of this is true, which it is, then we really wonder oh, how much of your 1982 to 90, the what I showed in the previous slide, oh, 6% increase in weight. Oh, maybe that's an overestimation for TINP. Maybe TINP is not that great. Maybe it's your public ration shops and your noon, all these other things which are contributing, right? So now the task before the people who are trying to impact evaluation for TINP is, how do you take care of this problem? Because it's a major problem. They were facing a major history threat, right? So far, I hope you agree, right? So before after is not good enough, because in this case, events coincided, and you're in serious danger of getting it wrong, your impact of TINP. To say, oh, 6%, that must be TINP is really problematic. So what did the OED, this is the evaluation arm of the World Bank, which funded it, and they had to now evolve some other strategy. Before I go any further, the answer is you have to create a control group. Yes? That's what the implication from what we said before. Before, after is not enough. If you create a reasonable control, it can't be a perfect control, but a reasonable control that can take care of your history threat, all your threats. Correct? That's what we saw. So what could be a control group? That is a group which did not get these other things which happened in Tamil Nadu.
Another
Will it be possible to find that group within Tamil Nadu?
Yeah, that's the first question. Correct? Will it or not?
outside the state, maybe.
Yeah. So their first strategy of OED, right, was to compare. Not all of Tamil Nadu got it. It was a large-scale program, but they still tried to focus on those districts of Tamil Nadu where malnutrition was higher. So their first strategy was compare TINP with non-TINP. What's the advantage of this? Because it's the same state, correct? Non-TINP areas within Tamil Nadu and TINP areas within Tamil Nadu. So they're all getting PDS, they're all getting Anganwadi, they're all getting noon meal program. Therefore, you could argue that that history threat sort of cancels out, right? Not fully, because we saw that it might still be not the same, but by comparing within Tamil Nadu, you're trying to neutralize these other issues. Also, the fact that there was major agrarian, agrarian incomes increase in Tamil Nadu, right? That's true across the state. So by comparing within Tamil Nadu, you're able to to some extent wash away all this Tamil Nadu specific effects, which coincided with TINP. Yeah. Is that good? The second possibility, of course, is what I think Nani or somebody was mentioning. Compare the TINP areas with some place outside Tamil Nadu, right? So first let's look at, so their main strategy was to compare TINP and non-TINP within Tamil Nadu. Why? Because they said this can help reduce all these Tamil Nadu specific history threats, because those history threats will happen in TINP and non-TINP areas. Just as coaching center will happen with both your control kids and your treatment kids, right? I mean, similar kind of logic. So it will cancel out. So in
Suraj,
fact, yes.
I'm really sorry to bring this up again, but I mean, this is really confusing me now because
Yeah, that's quite okay, Nani. The good news is it's one thing that we are sort of going around and around to kind of, right, understand better. So it's not like we are spreading ourselves over lots of things, but so just kind of take a step back and think. Before after is problematic. We discussed it earlier, correct? Because there could be various threats: history threat, maturation threat, all those threats, right? Those are abstract threats. For our sake, think of it as just history threat for now, which is something else is happening at the same time. For our maths program, they are going to coaching center at the same time as they are coming to your maths program. And the coaching center is really helping them, and your program is not. but their final scores are improving and you thought it's because of your program, correct? You're misattributing. Actually, it's because, so you need to, that's a problem, right? So you need to look at what else is happening at the same time, which might be affecting your result, correct? This could be a problem. So here, at the same way for TINP, you're running TINP, you're running all this nutritional counseling and this feeding and all that. But at the same time, in your schools, you're giving noon meal. The same time, you're having Anganwadis. At the same time, you're having ration shops, right? Many other things. At the same time, your agriculture incomes are improving. Many other things which might separately lead to infant weight increasing, correct? So then you're in trouble because unless you address this history threat, your before after is a problem, right? So far, Nani, I was just setting up that question, but you would appreciate that that's a problem, right? So far, so good. No, I think you're. No, feel free. I mean, it's just the history threat at work, which is something else is happening, which is affecting your outcome.
No, Suraj, I just think my brain is too tiny to take all of this in.
Okay, well, I don't think it has anything to do with any of that. So I'll just keep coming back to, so the history threat is a compelling issue, right? You don't need to get into any technicalities, right? Something is, I mean, yeah, just think of it in your personal life, right? You're doing some particular thing and you're finding that, oh, I'm going on a diet and my weight is reducing, but maybe something else is happening which is reducing your weight and not your diet, correct? Well, that may not be a great example because it's hard to think of what that other thing is, but many other things happening in the world. How do we know it's because of my program that I'm seeing these results, correct?
Yes.
That's what the history threat is. That's all.
Yes.
Right? Oh, coaching center is happening, and that's actually what is affecting maths. And I'm thinking by mistake, oh, it's my great program. Same way, all these other things are happening in Tamil Nadu. But I'm thinking, oh, my TINP is so great. Look, it's making all this. But it could be these other things. That's all we are saying. Fair enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now the left side is clear.
Yeah, the left side is just talking about various history threats, various other things which coincide with TINP. So you might get your attribution wrong. Maybe these are what's mattering and you're by mistake saying, oh, TINP is so great. So now the solution is to create a control group. Because a before and after is not good enough, correct? Which is what you have on the left side, correct? The before after. So you really need a control group. Now question is, how do you get a control group? And they did many strategies in TINP evaluation. One strategy was compare TINP with non-TINP.
No, got it.
So in fact, it turns out that in 3 non-TINP districts, these are parts of Tamil Nadu which are historically better off. Tanjavur, Nilgiris and Kanyakumari. Okay. Even there, malnutrition reduced by 3%. Sorry. There was a reduction in malnourishment, correct? So they are not getting TINP and still their malnourishment is reducing because of all your history.
All the left side, yeah. Left side factors.
Yeah. But what did they find? They found that the reduction in malnutrition in TINP districts was even more.
So TINP was also.
So they are saying, oh, there's an extra thing that TINP places. That must be because of TINP. And this was their main argument. They've written a lot of details, numbers, this, that, but the logic of the argument is this.
Yes. Now it's clear.
Right?
Yeah.
So, but without using a control group, you could get it really wrong. Here, at least you could say, oh, we've factored in all these other things. Right? So it's right. We are out of time. I think we should stop. Let me just we can continue next time. Let me just stop with a question since we have reached this, which is, do you think there's any problem with this logic? Oh, TINP and non-TINP. TINP districts, they had a bigger reduction in malnutrition. They did even better, but even the non-TINP did okay. So, right, this is like the diagram I showed, right? The control is also improving, but your treatment is improving even more. And so that difference, right? That's what's happening here. So my question is there anything, I mean, are you fully satisfied, or do you think there's any problem with this? I'm just turning that off.
I don't see there's a problem. It's like, and it's, but to come up with something very concrete, argument, some more details might be helpful, because both the for the control group example, both are possible and both might work when we have a very clear understanding why we have selected both the outside Tamil Nadu or within the Tamil Nadu group.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. But even without knowing too much, Rakesh, comparing TINP and non-TINP districts, and I know we will end now, comparing those two is sort of like going back to our maths example, comparing your 25 kids who are getting your remedial maths with the 75 kids who are good enough in the first place not to need any, correct? Remember, we said they're not strictly comparable.
Yeah.
So same way, the fact that Tanjavur and Kanyakumari did not need TINPs because they were better off in the first place. Correct? They didn't need your program, which makes them less comparable.
Yeah. Correct.
Right. So we are still, right. So it's not the best control to have. For the same reason that in our maths, the 75, now within the 75, like I said, if you can take a subset who are more comparable, right, that's better, right? So you could try something like that.
I'm going to remember what you said, na? While selecting control group, we have to be very, creative, and at the same time very logical in terms of what we want to look.
Yeah, and ultimately you have to tell a story, right? You have to justify why my control is pretty good. But if you did RCT, you don't have to do any justification. That's what the RCT people say. Oh, look, we don't need to, just because we are randomized, obviously they are similar.
But RCT, like, it's for a researcher point of view, it's very easy to defend it. But for explaining everything to someone,
it's not possible. Exactly.
Yeah,
politically, ethically, right? You're just playing dice with people. There are a lot of issues.
To probability.
No, but so that's what I'm saying. For our purpose of comparing, they're okay, but it has got many other problems, right? So the best solution would be to really get something like RCT without actually randomizing, correct? Having best of both. And I'll give you some examples of that as well, okay? Sort of this Operation Barga kind of example, they're comparable, but you didn't actually do any randomization. Okay, we'll end it there. It looks like we need a little more discussion of this. Am I right? I think next time let's have one or two cases. I'm planning with a little bit of small group discussion. But the good news is this: even though it looks like it's just one thing, right? Which is, how do you create a counterfactual which is believable, so that you can say that this is what your program did, right? At the end of the day, that's all it is to it. It's sort of what Rakesh was saying. At the end of the day, a creative, generation of control. That's not easy, but that's crucial. So I'll come back to it. I sense this is, I think if you're not used to it, maybe as Nani also articulated, maybe it takes a little bit of getting used to. It's just fine. So let's continue. We'll take another more detailed example next week. Is that fine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Suraj. Thanks all for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
We'll see you next week. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.